Shanker Singham is a world-leading trade lawyer. He's worked on the accession of Poland and Hungary to the EU and the WTO accessions of China and Russia, and he's now the director of the International Trade and Competition Unit at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thanks very much for talking to us, Shanker.
Thank you.
People talk a lot about there being two choices left in Brexit between Chequers, Theresa May's plan for Brexit, and for no deal. Is that how you see it?
Not really. So I think what you have to do when you look at this is the Chequers proposal is only a proposal that the UK government has made, and we tend to spend a lot of time negotiating with ourselves and determining what we think the ultimate plan is going to be. There is another side to this negotiation, and that's the EU. But it's even broader than that. So the EU negotiation fits into a number of other negotiations that we're doing, and it fits into our overall independent trade policy and our overall domestic regulatory policy. And I think the goal of this whole process is how do we have a competitive and thriving economy in the UK? And the rest of this is a means to an end. So if you start at that level and you say, well, the way to have a competitive and thriving economy is to have an independent trade policy. Lockwood Smith, the former New Zealand High Commissioner, has talked about this only makes sense if we have a smart global trade strategy. And that involves deals with lots of other countries, it involves WTO, it involves domestic regulatory improvements. And of course it involves, as part of that overall agenda, a deal with the EU. But I think the way to look at this is more a series of moves in a game of chess rather than a binary choice. What moves should we be making with the EU? Well, we should be putting an offer on the table. There's no doubt about that. We should have done that quite some time ago. And speeches and white papers are not offers. They're not things that the other side can deal with. So we need to start putting text on the table, and that text needs to be reflective of that independent trade policy. So the first thing you should do is not take your independent trade policy off the table. Unfortunately, the Chequers proposal does that. It means we won't be able to negotiate a deal with the US, because the US will not negotiate with the UK if we are harmonised by treaty to the European rulebook on goods and agri-food. You won't be able to accede to the TPP because you've harmonised to the European rulebook, and you won't be able to do domestic regulatory reform because you've again harmonised and locked yourself into the European rulebook. So the first thing not to do is don't take your trade policy and your regulatory policy off the table, because if you do that, you've got no opportunities, and you're only in a management of disruption environment, which cannot be a good result. So unfortunately, Chequers does all of those things. So I think what we need to do, and I also think it's going to be quite difficult for the European Union to accept it as it currently is. It's going to be very difficult for them to accept a partial, effectively single market in goods and agri-food, but not in services. And what about goods that have services attached to them? What about horizontal regulations that are not covered by labour, environment, competition and state aids? So they're going to have quite a lot of difficulties with this. I suspect that many Conservative MPs are going to have enormous difficulties with this sort of proposal. And so I think we need to get back to a plan that preserves your independent trade policy and gets us back to negotiating what the Prime Minister has talked about in the past for the last 2 years, which is a comprehensive, deep free trade agreement with the EU with the maximum of regulatory recognition, because on day one we are starting with completely aligned regulatory systems and a mechanism to manage that divergence. But you don't get there by saying that's what you want. You get there by putting a proposal on the table, by negotiating with other people, the US, TPP accession, by negotiating in the WTO as we go through our WTO transition. And you have to put all of these things together. It's very much like a three-dimensional game of chess. And you make various moves at various times based on how you've set the pieces up. I think, unfortunately, we've been playing checkers and we need to be playing chess.
But you've got Conservatives like James Cleverly, who voted for Brexit, who just says, look, Chequers is a way of getting out of the European Union, and then we can harden it afterwards. We can harden up Brexit afterwards. Do you not think time is running out and this might be the only chance we get?
Well, I fully understand why people are looking for compromises, and actually the compromises come once you start negotiating the trade agreement, and then we will have to make some compromises. We won't get everything that we want, but the compromises don't come before you even started, and the compromises can't be false compromises. So the notion that anything that takes your independent trade policy and regulatory policy off the table takes all the opportunities off the table. So I'm just talking in terms of economics and in terms of the trading system of the UK, not sort of notional sovereignty and so forth. But anything that takes all those things off the table prevents you from seeing any of the benefits. And therefore, as many of our trade commissioners have said, and as I've said, if you're going to do this by taking all your opportunities off the table, you may as well stay in the EU. There's no reason to leave. So I think we have to be very careful of false compromises where people think that this is sort of acceptable and think that the EU will sort of agree with us on this. We also have to remember that we have allowed ourselves to be bound by the European negotiating mandate. Very few other countries in the world simply throw their arms in the air and just follow the European negotiating mandate. But in order to get on the front foot and take control of the agenda, you have to have legal text of an agreement that you can proffer to the other side and say, well, this is what we think it should look like. You come back to us with your red line version of that text, and if you can't do that, then you are going to be subject to the other the negotiating mandate and the timing that is set by the other side. Yes, clearly we should have been doing a lot of things. We should have been preparing text. We should have been putting text on the table. We should have been preparing for the eventuality that the Europeans don't agree to do a free trade agreement with us. Accelerating our customs preparedness, accelerating how would we deal with regulatory recognition of medicines and other things. This notion that we can get out any way we can. So some people have suggested we can be in the EEA, not be in the customs union, be in the EEA, and then sort of seek to diverge if we want to at that stage. The problem with all of those ideas about hardening up, or at least giving us a bit more flexibility in the future, having agreed this, is that the EEA is an agreement with the European Union. They have to agree with you that you will do this. So at some point, you're going to have to make the same decision that we have to make now in terms of regulatory divergence. And while you want to preserve the ability to diverge, you don't need to diverge as long as there's a mechanism to manage that process. But it's very difficult once you're locked into a particular arrangement with the EU. It's incredibly difficult to change it. If you think about the power of the vested interests and the incumbent businesses, the beneficiaries of the status quo now, as exemplified by the CBI and so forth. If you think about how powerful those voices are now, imagine how much more powerful they will be once you've locked in to European regulation in such a way that you've also lost the ability to influence it. So it's changing. And the more time that goes past and the more it diverges from where you might want to be as a country that is embracing free trade and competition and these things which are where your wealth creation comes from, the more difficult it will be to actually do that. And there will come a point where it becomes almost impossible politically to do that.
So you don't see realistically Chequers being a path towards
No.
greater freedom, greater trade freedom?
It's not. It's not. Just like EFTA plus the EEA is not a pathway to an independent trade policy. There is only one pathway to an independent trade policy, and that is to enter into a free trade agreement with the European Union that enables you to have regulatory divergence. Now, you are never in the international trading system free to do whatever you want. I mean, we are constrained by the WTO to do things that discriminate against others. And we will, in the agreement we have with the EU, we will be somewhat constrained in what we can do in terms of regulations. Now the question becomes, in the trade agreement context, how much do you allow yourself to be constrained, and how do you use the flexibility that you're able to secure? And that's where the compromise comes. That's where we'll have, a back and forth about precisely which areas we want bigger divergence possibilities in, and how you manage that divergence process. And you get to the compromise when you're in the middle of the game. Just going back to my chess analogy, you don't do the compromise before you've even started the game. So that's how I would think of that.
You've spoken about the TPP. Can you just explain what that is?
Yeah. So the TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's now called the CPTPP. It was renamed once the Americans had Trump had very famously pulled the US out of it. It's an agreement amongst currently 11 nations, countries like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Colombia, these sorts of countries. And it is the most advanced, and Japan, and it's the most advanced liberalising trade arrangement, platform agreement that we have in the world. And it's taken a long time to get it to where it is. It started really with a bilateral negotiation between the New Zealanders and the Singaporeans, who recognised that the global trading system was slowing down and stalling, and they needed to do something to revive it. Those two countries didn't trade very much with each other, but they recognised that it's actually very important to put down disciplines in the trading system that are very liberalising, that remove discrimination, that remove distortion. That's how you, again, create wealth and grow the economies. And that agreement became the P4, then the P4+1 as Australia came in, as the Chileans came in. And then it added others. The US then took it on as a sort of coalition of the willing group of countries that were willing to liberalise more in trade terms while the WTO was stalled. And so an enormous amount of work has gone into it. And, we've done a very good job of getting the TPP countries to make formal offers for the UK to accede to the TPP, which is a significant thing. I mean, the TPP, in terms of economic weight, the TPP plus the UK is about the same as EU28 minus the UK, roughly the same sort of economic overall GNP. And of course, it contains the countries that are in Asia and in North America, the fastest growing economies in the world. So it's incredibly important that the UK sort of faces those economies. And anything that we do in the world to deal with our trading relationship with the biggest, one of the biggest market in the world, China, is ultimately going to be not bilateral, it's going to be through organisations and platform agreements like the TPP.
So you see the TPP as a vehicle for liberalising world trade, but you see the customs union and the single market as kind of putting the dampers on that. I mean, can you just expand on that? Yeah,
so I think this is a sort of not well understood point, and it's critical to the whole process, because if the basic conditions were different, then the answer to this problem would be different. So, for example, if you look at the EU over the last 30 years, I think that one can make a case that the EU was a force for global liberalisation and more competition and better regulations in the early stages. I mean, certainly when Britain acceded to the EU, we were a very, very closed economy. We had nationalised virtually everything. We needed the discipline, frankly, of the four freedoms of the EU and the competition provisions, the state aids provisions. These were good for the UK, and they are still, some of them good for, acceding countries from Central and Eastern Europe, for example, that are moving from highly distorted systems. Over time, and it's quite a recent change, but it's a change that's now accelerating. What we've seen from the EU is progressively more and more anti-competitive regulation, whether it's GDPR or MiFID II or a host of regulations that we in the IEA, every week we have a European regulation of the week, and we analyse the anti-competitive effect. And we're going to do this, we've done 4 so far, and we'll continue to do this forever. There's plenty of source material. And to show people that actually a lot of the regulatory burden and the regulatory system in the EU is not just that it's a business cost, and people tend to focus on that, It's also a market cost. It damages consumers. It damages consumer welfare, therefore destroys wealth out of the economy, and it pushes people into poverty. And it's one of the reasons why the EU is not a very entrepreneurial area. It's one of the least performing entrepreneurial areas in the world, according to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And there's a reason for that. It's the constraint of the highly prescriptive and anti-competitive EU rulebook. And that is a significant problem. And I think that is accelerating, that direction of travel is accelerating. And clearly without the UK has been very much a brake on some of that. It'll accelerate even faster. And so we need to make a choice. Either we're going to stay on that train, and locking into the European regulatory system puts you fully in that train. You may not be anywhere near the driving seat, but you are on the train. Or do we jump off the train now, recognising that it's going to a not a good destination, accept a bit of the rough and tumble of jumping off the train, but knowing that we will then have the ability to get on another train and go in another direction. So that's incredibly important. The overall framework globally in terms of the global trading system is also very important. If the global trading system was not in crisis, if things were moving very well with the global trading system, if we'd negotiated the Doha round, we were busily negotiating other services agreements, and liberalisation was taking effect and barriers were coming down, we weren't in a situation where regulatory barriers and regulatory protection was massively on the increase, as we have seen that it is massively on the increase, then again, the role of the world's second biggest exporter of services would be much different. But the fact is that the global trading system is in crisis, that there are serious questions about the existence even of the WTO, and the authority of the appellate body in the WTO and other things. Given the crisis that is in, I think there's a sense of urgency that we need to do something differently. And that's why other countries outside of the UK who don't see us the way we see ourselves, I mean, they look at us and they say, fifth biggest economy in the world, second biggest exporter of services, clearly you're going to make a difference when you are a full member in your own right of the WTO. And are able to operate in the WTO, clearly you will help the system. Sometimes I think we look at ourselves and we think we're a second-rate power in decline and we can't do anything. That's not how the rest of the world sees it, and it's not what they expect. They expect the UK to be more of a force.
And what would the rest of the world? How would they take the idea that we'd have another referendum on EU membership if we had a referendum on Chequers or staying in altogether? Yeah,
I mean, I think the rest of the world right now, after the Lancaster House speech, there was a lot of clarity in the minds, not only of the EU, but I think of the rest of the world, that everyone understood what we were going to do. We were going to be out of the customs union, out of the single market, and negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU. And they get that. They understand how to negotiate a trade deal with you if you're negotiating trade deals with others at the same time. That's the way the world works. So I think there was a lot of clarity there and a lot of understanding there at that time, and there was a lot of goodwill for the UK. Largely because people saw that having the UK, major G7 economy, huge exporter of services in the trading system would be a good thing. Just as the Japanese recognised that having the UK in the TPP would be a good thing. Now, we have had from that moment less and less clarity rather than more and more clarity. And I think other countries now, their patience is wearing thin. I think they're confused about what the UK seems to want. They doubt whether this type of approach to negotiating with the EU works. They have all, of course, negotiated with the EU, and they have found that the best way to negotiate with the EU is to make sure you have lots of things going on at the same time. If you don't, then you're unlikely to get a good arrangement. And they're sort of looking at the trajectory of Lancaster House, the Florence speech, Mansion House, Chequers, as a trajectory leading us to the customs union single market as a rule taker. And, or effectively, those things. And one can make an argument that the facilitated customs arrangement plus the plus the the rule book, the harmonisation to the EU rule book in goods and agri-food, is basically customs union single market light. But it will make you a rule taker, and they're looking at that and saying, well, maybe we don't want to throw our eggs in that basket. Maybe we don't want to spend a lot of negotiating capital. The fact that the Japanese are still saying TPP accession, we want you to accede to the TPP. The fact the Americans are still saying they want us to do a deal, US-UK free trade agreement, are incredibly valuable things, and they're being served up, to the government on a plate. And it would be a real it would be a tragedy if that was wasted.
So we would be able to achieve all of these things if we'd chuck Chequers, and also if we had a free trade agreement, just a simple free trade agreement with the EU, but we'd also be able to do those if we left without a deal. I mean, what would that look like?
Yeah, so leaving without a free trade agreement, first of all, it's you're leaving without a free trade agreement now. That doesn't mean you won't have a free trade agreement at some point in the future. So it isn't a case of, it's binary, either no FTA now with the EU, never ever, and we do our own thing, or FTA now with the EU. There's a time component to this. So if there isn't a free trade agreement with the EU by the time we leave, whenever that is, then and I think we have to differentiate between what is no deal, nothing, versus no free trade agreement. I think what we're really talking about here is no free trade agreement. If there isn't a free trade agreement, then one of the things we would have to do is accelerate our negotiations with other parties, and they wouldn't be constrained by arrangements with the EU, so they could be much faster and much easier. So US deal, CPTPP accession, what we do in the WTO, how we take control of our schedules in the WTO, that's our tariff schedules, and our services schedules. We could do that much more quickly and much more easily. So that's certainly one effect. If we're trying to negotiate an agreement with the EU while at the same time negotiating an agreement with the US, there are some opportunities of doing that. You can to some extent read across negotiations, and you can play people off against each other to some extent. But it also adds a level of complication. You need to really know what you're doing to be able to do that. So we wouldn't have that complication if we left without a deal. And part of no deal preparedness or preparation is what you do on the trade side. So, for example, the DIT, Liam Fox's department, their no deal preparation is trying to make sure they get these trade deals and make sure they don't slip off the off the plate. Make sure we get our WTO process moving forward. All the things that we need there in terms of the agricultural import quotas and the agreements we need to accede to, like the government procurement agreement. Their no deal preparedness is getting all that done as effectively and quickly as they possibly can.
So we will survive if we leave without a formal trade deal?
I think it's clearly not optimal. It's not the optimal outcome. It's not what we want. We want a trade agreement with the EU, and frankly, I think the EU also wants a trade agreement with the UK. They would like to have the UK in the customs union and the single market as a rule taker, politically, not necessarily commercially, but politically they would like that. And as long as that remains a possibility, they're going to continue to play hardball with us. We should have taken that off the table, clearly, and then both sides would have wanted a trade agreement. And I think we can continue to move down that road. Now, that's the best situation. If we don't get that, and we may not get an FTA with the EU for all kinds of reasons that are totally out of our control, in which case, what do you do in that case? You must prepare as well as you can for the eventuality that there isn't such a deal. And how you would prepare for that eventuality means, first of all, with respect to customs, there are a lot of things, and we have a paper that my colleague Victoria Houston authored called Under Control, which has some of the things in customs that we could and should, and we frankly should have been doing this previously, to ensure customs is a bit more prepared. There are a lot of things that we can do to improve customs. We should be doing them now anyway. Some of these things are things we should be doing regardless of Brexit, frankly. Our customs is not as good as, say, the Dutch, who operate a much more effective customs, have a much more effective customs operation. So customs preparedness is certainly one thing. Investigating new technologies and so on. The Centre for Economics and Business Research just did a paper on smart ledgers and how you use them to reduce the cost of customs and reduce the cost of the delays caused by an increase in the number of customs forms. So things like that, we should be doing. You want to do everything you can to see how you can make your systems minimise clearance costs and so forth for customs. And then you've also got to do things like, well, if in fact there is no trade deal and no regulatory recognition for things like medicine and food and other things, we're going to have to unilaterally recognise European product regulation and standards, which we would have no problem doing, but we have to actually do something. We have to actually put that into practice. The relevant agencies need to organise for unilateral recognition of, say, batch testing and release for pharmaceutical products. A lot of this should have been done before, hasn't been done, and I think some real questions have to be asked about why they haven't been done, because there's, again, no reason not to prepare for this eventuality. And if you look at the European response and their Article 50 notices, what the Europeans are doing is they're assuming there won't be an implementation period and there won't be any of these things and there won't be a deal, and they're advising their businesses on that basis and they're advising other businesses on that basis. We haven't done that. We're clinging to the hope that there will be an implementation period, in which case we can just kick the can down the road, and that's a mistake. We absolutely need to engage in all of those preparedness options.
You helped Poland and Hungary get into the EU, is that right? Well,
that was early stages. So we helped write the association agreements and the Europe agreements prior to their accessions.
So what would you be advising them to do now? I mean, do you think EU membership has been a benefit to those countries?
Well, I think at the time that we were doing that work, it was sort of mid-90s. So it took them quite a while to accede. There's quite a lot of stuff they had to do to accede. But actually, I think the accession process for those countries was very good for them. But you have to remember that Poland and Hungary and the Central and Eastern European countries were coming from a very different place from where the UK is. Even countries like Spain, in many ways benefit from European, the regulatory system of the EU, because from their context, from where they're coming from, which is a highly distorted regulatory environment that is full of trade barriers and full of regulatory barriers, the EU looks good to them, so it actually helps them improve. But the UK is on the other side of this. We've evolved from the 70s through to now. We've gone through the privatisation process, we've gone through the economic reforms of the 80s, and we have a relatively competitive market. Could be improved, no question, but we're very different from those countries. So I think we can't sort of compare the two.
Final question. You've spoken about how the rest of the world sees the UK. So you said they see us as the 5th largest economy, the 2nd largest exporter of services. How do the rest of the world see the EU, and how do trade negotiators see the European Union?
Well, that's a very good question. And if you go to Geneva and you talk to the WTO ambassadors of other countries, if you were to say to them, do you think the EU is a force for global liberalisation, they would laugh at you. The EU has a reputation in the world trading system of being a bit of an outlier in terms of their approach, particularly to regulation. So the idea that they won't recognise you unless you are identical, which is their sort of opening bid, their starting position, is an outlier position in the rest of the world. So there is no love lost between trade negotiators from other countries and the EU. And I will say one thing, that the EU is not monolithic on this. So quite often what happens is DG Trade, the European Union's trade negotiating arm, is actually trying to negotiate good liberalising deals offensively. So they were very active in the founding of the Trade and Services Plurilateral Agreement in the WTO. So they're quite often trying to do the right thing. But they'll find they are countermanded from the centre. So the centre is doing other things like the GDPR, for example, the data protection rules. And they find that actually now they're in a position where they can't do the liberalising things that they want to do. And other directorate generals in the EU are in a similar sort of position. But again, if you look at the direction of travel, and this is what other countries are sort of observing, and I was a cleared advisor to the US government on trade regulatory issues for 6 years, from 2009 to 2015. And in that period, we saw a movement in the EU away from what I would call pro-competitive, liberalising regulatory system where wealth is created, to a much more prescriptive dirigiste kind of system. And I think they recognise that makes them uncompetitive, but they equally don't want to change it. And therefore the only way to be competitive is to force the rest of the world to adopt your regulatory system, which is what they're trying to do with things like GDPR and other regulations. And this matters a lot, because if that is successful, then we will end up with a less competitive world. And in a world where there are more distortions, more wealth is destroyed, more people are pushed into poverty, the growth rate goes down, there are significant problems if that occurs, in terms of unemployment, in terms of deficits and so forth. It's austerity for much longer periods. It's very bad for everyone in the world. So I think this is a very important moment. And I think other countries recognise that this is an important moment, that in many ways, not deliberate, not by its own choosing, the UK has sort of made itself a global regulatory battleground. And either it's going to lock into the European regulatory orbit and then promulgate it around the world, which I think would be a negative result for the world. And since we're part of the world, it would be a negative result for us. Or it's going to be something else. It's going to, move in a different direction, which is more in the spirit of a system based on reducing barriers, better regulation by competition, more competitive system, and regulation that is the least trade restrictive and the least anti-competitive, consistent with a clearly stated legitimate regulatory goal. That's the way the trading system, world trading system is that's the direction it's going. And it's a direction which says, countries ought to recognise each other's regulations. They ought to recognise each other's systems, as long as their outcomes are the same and there are just technical differences between them. That should not defeat recognition. That identicality should not be the test of recognition. So that's a very different way of looking at things than the EU, frankly, is looking at things. And that's what's bringing them into conflict with everybody else. And that's why I do refer to them as an outlier in this area.